the amazing termite. The termite builds huge castles, as you can see from this photograph. I'm about 2 meters high. Sorry, 1.8 meters high. Look how tall that particular mound is. What's all this about? Why do termites build these huge mounds? They're mostly found in the Northern Territory of Australia. That's what we might call termite country, because the landscape there is rather strange. It's what they call savanna. It has trees separated by open areas which are covered with grass. And because the trees don't touch each other, there's light can get through from the sky and keep the grass growing. So it's a mixture of grass and small trees. And this is the kind of territory where the termites are to be found. There's a lovely picture of a typical savanna. You can see the grass and you can see the trees. Okay, well, termites, like ants and bees, are social insects. They live in huge communities which have different jobs partitioned out between them. And unlike ants and bees, they're blind. They live underground all their life. They don't need to see because all their life is spent underneath where there's no light. And they feed on wood and grasses. Now, in order to digest those cellulose products, they have special enzymes in their mouth that can digest the cellulose, and also in their gut, their intestines, they have bacteria which can break down cellulose, a bit like cows do in their many stomachs, which you might have read about. So it's the same idea. They're using bacteria to change the indigestible cellulose into sugars and things which they can use for their life. Right, so like ants and bees, they're divided into castes, different classes. The most important person is the queen, because she lays all the eggs, and she can live up to 25 years. Obviously, you have to have a king to fertilize the eggs, otherwise there won't be any babies. But the vast majority of the termites in that mound are worker bees, and their job is to fetch food, to look after the larvae, and to do this work for up to 5 years, quite much longer, in fact, than bees and ants do. Here's a photograph of the different castes. So start off on the left here. That's the worker termite. You see it doesn't have any eyes. Here's the soldier termite, which is armed with some very strong pincers to defend the colony against enemies trying to get in. This next picture here is of a queen on one day of her life when she flies up into the sky to mate. But when she comes back down again, having mated, she chops off her wings and she becomes a big, fat, lazy queen, like you can see here inside the nest. And finally, of course, the king, a male termite, which fertilizes the eggs. Here's a rather repulsive picture of a termite queen. This mound has been broken open and they found the termite queen. So that's the egg-laying machine that lasts up to 25 years. Here's a termite soldier with its very pointed and sharp jaws, a sort of creature you wouldn't want to come across in the dark, would you? Okay, let's have a look at this nest. The main nest the termites live in is actually under the ground, below the surface. And it creates tunnels radiating out to all the nearby trees and grasses in all directions. And when the workers go along these little tunnels and come to a tree, they chew the wood of the tree and bring tiny chips of it back to the nest. So when they get to a tree, they go up through the roots of the tree, up the stem, and out into the branches, but they very carefully leave the outmost layer of a branch or twig so they can't be seen. Looking at the tree, you would not know it's been eaten away by termites. It's only done so internally, so to speak. And that's interesting. So this mound you see in the pictures is built over the nest, right? And these mounds are frequently 3 meters high. Some go up to even 6 meters high, 20 feet. That's pretty high. And they grow by about 2 centimeters every year, half an inch every year. Some of these mounds have been shown to last 50 years before they fall to pieces. Well, inside those mounds are thousands of storage chambers to store little chips of grass and wood. Here's a diagram that helps. Here's the mound, look, with its storage chambers. Here's the underground tunnel through which the workers go backwards and forwards. Here's a tree, and they go up into the tree, hollow out the branches, and bring the wood back to the mound for storage. Grasses, likewise, will be taken back into the mound for storage. Aborigines will actually go along in the forest and tap on tree branches to find one that has been hollowed out by the termite. Why do they want to hollow a tree branch? Because they turn it into the wind instrument they use for their dances, the didgeridoo. So here you can see a hollow branch that's been eaten away by the termites, and they turn that into a didgeridoo. Well, let's go back to these storage chambers and the mound. So if we were to cut open a hole in the side of the mound, you can see these multiple little chambers. And actually, this picture was taken in a museum, but you can see how for storage, these little cells are packed tight with dried grass and wood chips, ready for the future. Why do they need to make this preparation for the future? Well, it's very interesting. In the north of Australia that we're talking about, there are only two seasons, the dry and the wet. In the UK, we have 4 seasons, spring, summer, autumn, and winter. But out there's only 2. It's either dry or it's wet. And it means very dry and it means very wet, because the dry lasts all the way from May through to November, no rain. And during that time, the dry, the ground will dry right out, it'll crack. The rivers will shrink to just a line of ponds with nothing joining them together. And that's how it is until the wet season starts in February. And in February, it rains, and it rains. It's a monsoon rain, and it rains continuously until the whole countryside is covered with water. Here's a diagram showing the 2 seasons, the drought and the monsoon, August and February, opposite times of the year. Okay, now, this is what happens when the wet season begins, when it starts to rain, this monsoon rain. The river starts to run. The whole countryside turns to huge lakes of water. Here's a picture of the dry riverbed filled with water and beginning to overflow. And there's a depth gauge there to warn you how much the water can go up by. Imagine 2 meters of water all across the countryside, and you get something like this. It's almost like a huge inland lake spreading everywhere. So what happens now is that the fish in those dried up riverbeds and ponds can now come up out of the river channel and swim freely across the countryside, moving, migrating, breeding, of course, as well. And the crocodiles will come out of their ponds where they've been sleeping during the dry season, and they'll swim across the countryside as well. Here's a picture of a giant crocodile in the savannah country. So the Aborigines who inhabit this part of the country, when the wet comes, obviously you can't survive if you've got a meter of water over the whole countryside. There's no food to eat anything in anyway. So they migrate into caves in the mountains to escape from the floods, to get up above the wet. And here's a photograph of a typical Aborigine cave, which is known by archaeologists to have been used like this year after year, century after century, for hundreds of years. You actually see on the wall here an Aboriginal painting, which has been there for centuries. Here's some of the cooking fires. You can see the black smoke where the cooking fires were. And these little hollows here have been made into the rock to grind nuts and food like that that's very hard. So that's where they go in the wet. It's a recognizable painting of a kangaroo by some Aborigine artist, again, hundreds of years ago. So as this water spreads across the land, birds come in from all round to eat the fish, which are now breeding, multiplying, lots of baby fish to gobble up, and everything gets busy. So again, why do we have these mounds for the termites? And the obvious answer is that in the wet season, the termites can move up into the mounds above the water. And they go back to their underground tunnels when the dry comes and the water dries out from the land. So what's really fascinating is this. Those termites in Northern Territory of Australia are actually fulfilling the same role in the pyramid of life as deer and cattle and big wild creatures like that in other countries like Africa. They are underground grazers on a huge scale. They're not eating, not in the main eating green stuff above the surface. They live under the surface and they live on the wood of trees or dry grass. But they do it on a huge scale. Now, when spring comes, the worker bees will allow some of the babies to grow up with wings and eyes. Yes, eyes to see. Why do they need wings? Why do they need eyes? Because this particular generation of termites are going to fly up into the sky to mate, which is essential to find a partner. So on a particular day, when they judge that the temperature of the air and the humidity is just right, the soldiers will relax their guard at the entrance of the termite mound and allow these winged females and their partners to fly up into the sky. And the thing is, on the same day, other termite mounds for kilometers around will send out their flying termites as well. So the whole sky becomes full of these flying termites, millions of them, all over the countryside, up in the air. And the flying day. Well, some of those termites, of course, are going to mate and fall to the ground. They then bite off their wings and start building a new mound in an empty space. And then we have another colony on its way. Here's a photograph of a termite queen who's just come down, and she's going to build a new mound away from the parent one. Now, on this great flying day, we have something a little bit like this in the UK with ants, don't we? We have a day in the summer when the ants all seem to go together. It's like that. All the birds and reptiles for kilometers around will come together to eat the vast numbers of these flying termites. And so the nutrients, which during the last year have been gathered together from the grasses and trees by the termites and put into the bodies of these flying queens, are taken up into the air. They're eaten by the birds and reptiles when they fall to the ground, and the nutrients in their bodies are then distributed over a really wide area. Here's the diagram. Here's the mounds. Look, there's the flying termites going up. Here's the birds coming to eat the flying termites. Reptiles down here. Look, lizards and birds on the floor. Even snakes waiting to help themselves to the fallen termites. And so the nutrients in the bodies of those creatures are now spread over the whole countryside by these creatures that eat them and those that just simply fall to the ground. So it's exactly the same as what happens with deer and cattle in Africa. Deer and cattle will gather nutrients from the grass and shrubs that they eat, and then as they move along, they will deposit in their dung the same nutrients over a very large area. So the whole countryside becomes fertilized with nutrients. Of course, eventually those huge mounds, which are constructed from the saliva of termites and the dung that they pass out, eventually break down, and they too supply plant foods to the ground nearby where the termite mound was. What's rather fascinating is a special group of termites you find in Northern Territory, which are called magnetic termites. What does this mean? Well, in some areas we find rows of thin termite mounds, which are orientated north and south. Here's a picture. Look, it looks a bit like tombstones, doesn't it? But actually, they're not tombstones. These are termite mounds, but they're very thin, compressed, and they're all, as you can see from the photograph, they're all lined up north and south. Why do they need to do that? Why north and south? Well, the scientists have shown that this particular orientation keeps the temperature in that mound much more stable, because termites can't tolerate very high temperatures or very low ones either. They're quite sensitive to temperature. And at midday in Australia, the sun's not in the south like it is in the UK, it's in the north, that's when the temperature is highest. If it's orientated thin north-south, that thin mound has a very minimum profile for the sun's rays to beat on it when it's hot, the hottest part of the day. And as the sun moves round to the evening, the rays come in on the side, which helps to keep them warm in the cool part of the day. But how do these termites know which way is north and south? Well, again, experiments have shown these termites use the Earth's magnetic field to help them line up their mounds north-south. You can deceive them by putting artificial magnets close to them, and they get distorted then. Well, their mounds in the wrong direction. So, what conclusions can we draw? It's rather remarkable that in territory where deer and cattle couldn't survive the wet season, that's the point. There is grass in the savannah, but in the wet, you've got a metre of water all over the whole countryside. They couldn't survive. So in that sort of territory, these termites carry out the same role that deer and cattle do in dry countries like Africa. How could they learn by evolution to survive the wet season by building mounds? How does the termite know a wet season is coming and we need to do something about it? Obviously, they can't think ahead like human beings can. And so, as Bible readers, we feel it makes more sense to believe that God created them to fit this environment, to fit the missing place of the deer and cattle in more tropical countries. And this is what it says in the first chapter of Genesis. God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. I suppose the termites would be classified as those things that creep on the ground or even underneath the ground. Well, I hope you found that interesting and good to have you with us. I hope perhaps you'll come back and hear some more. So I'll say cheerio now.